Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to my January wrap-up. Today I'm going to be talking about the books that I read in the month of January. Before I get into talking about the books, I do have a few housekeeping things. Mostly I just want to tell you that videos will probably be a little bit sparse on my channel in the month of February. I'm still going to try and have one up a week, but I might not be able to get the two a week up, which I usually aim for. There are three reasons for this, really. One is just that I'm really busy at work at the moment, and so that's kind of impacting a little bit on my booktube time. Two is that my boyfriend Nick, who a lot of you will have seen on this channel before, is moving abroad with work for 6 months at the beginning of March, which means February is just full of a lot of plans, which will be really nice, but means, again, less time for booktube. And the third reason, which in some ways is the biggest one, is that I've just got a new laptop, which is really exciting. It's all shiny and new. My old laptop I'd had for 4.5 years and took 20 minutes to turn on and had no battery life at all, by which I mean literally like if you accidentally jogged the cable when it was plugged in, it would turn off immediately and you'd lose all your work. It wasn't a good laptop. I'm very glad to have a new one. And I'm also quite grateful too, because I wouldn't have really been able to afford / justify buying a new laptop if I hadn't have got a lot of the money for it from YouTube ad revenue, which is very nice. I do think the video editing did polish off my old laptop a little bit because it's a lot of large files which that laptop could not handle. But anyway, I have a new laptop, which is very exciting. But the one issue with the fact that I have a new laptop is that the video editing software I've been using for the last 3.5 years while I've been on BookTube is a program called Windows Movie Maker, which is very basic and no longer exists. So I have it on my old laptop, but I can't get it on my new laptop because it no longer exists, which means I need to find and learn how to use a new video editing software. This video, which you're watching now, will probably be the last video that I edit on Windows Movie Maker on my old laptop, and then I need to learn how to use a new video editing software, which means there might be a little bit of a gap between this video and the next video. And on that note, if anybody has any recommendations for video editing software, that would be really useful. I'm looking for something that is quite easy to use and intuitive, like Windows Movie Maker, with a few more capabilities and options and, you know, being able to insert pictures on the screen and things like. But I also can't spend lots of money. And really, I would be looking for video editing software that is either free or quite cheap. I have a PC laptop, not a Mac. So if anyone has any recommendations of video editing software, that would be incredibly useful as well. And the next time you see a video from me, it might be with different video editing software and I can put pictures in maybe. That would be nice. Anyway, that's enough housekeeping for now. Videos may be a little bit sparse in February, but in March, hopefully I'll be back up to full strength and 2 videos a week. So I read 15 books in the month of January, although 6 of them were unpublished books that I read for work, so I can't talk about them today. For those of you who don't know, I work in publishing. I work for an imprint called Zaffa, which is part of Bonnier Books UK. So some of the books I read this month I can't talk to you about, but so let's go into the books that I can talk about. Firstly, in January, I finished War and Peace. This edition is a lie. This is not the edition I read. I did not read this translation, but it's the only physical copy I had. I actually read War and Peace on Kindle, and I read the Maud translation. So War and Peace took me about 2.5 months, I would say. I finished it in the middle of January, and I had started it at the beginning of November. I have mixed feelings. I gave it 4 stars, and I think I was expecting that I would give it 5 stars before I started reading it, partly because I loved the television adaptation that was on a few years ago so much, and also because I loved Anna Karenina so much. But overall, I didn't like War and Peace quite as much as Anna Karenina. For those of you who don't know, because I feel like War and Peace is one of those books that is incredibly famous, but a lot of people don't actually know what it's about. I don't think I really did till I saw the television adaptation. War and Peace is a Russian classic from the mid-19th century, I think, and it's set in the beginning of the 19th century, sort of between 1805 and about 1820, I think. And it follows various characters in the kind of Napoleonic Wars that Russia was in intermittently in that time period. Some of it I absolutely loved, and some of it was absolutely fantastic, and then some of it was less so. I think one thing is that I genuinely think it's too long. Like, as a book, it's so long and it's so huge, and there are a lot of chapters in there that you could take out and you wouldn't lose anything. Like, the editor in me wants to go through War and Peace and be like, cut that chapter, cut that chapter, cut that chapter. And the main thing I found that dragged and that I found quite slow was a lot of the war chapters. I loved all the peace things, and whenever we were kind of focused on narrative scenes with the main characters, I really enjoyed it. But there are a lot of chapters in War and Peace that are like historical background, where Tolstoy is writing what feels more like non-fiction, or where he's writing fictionalized accounts of real people, like Napoleon, but because they were real figures, he doesn't have the same kind of level of characterization and emotional depth as he has in the other chapters. So it's like half the book, or 3/4 of the book, is a novel, and then the other quarter is like a docudrama in book form, which I didn't like as much. Like, every time a chapter was about Napoleon, I found it really dull. Whereas when we were with the main fictional characters, I found it really engaging and really compelling. And I think so, of the main characters, I loved Natasha. She was amazing. Prince Andrew was brilliant to read about. I really loved reading about Mary, and like Pierre was just my favourite character. Every time he was centre stage in the book, I was really happy. But another one of the main characters in this book, Nicholas Rostov, I just absolutely hated, and I really found his character so frustrating because I disliked him so vehemently. And I didn't like his plot trajectory because of that, because I felt like he was a character I was supposed to sympathise with, but who I just could not sympathise with. So overall, I really enjoyed War and Peace. Definitely a 4-star read. Some bits I loved, but there were some bits I liked less. I could have done with less war and less Nicholas Rostov and more of Natasha and Pierre, who I did really enjoy it. I'm very glad I've read it, but I don't think it's one I'm that likely to reread in the future. Anyway, on to the next book. In the month of January, I also read No Name by Wilkie Collins. This was a buddy read which I read alongside Kate Howe, and for both of us this was very much kind of 3-star Victorian read. There were some bits that I really enjoyed, but it wasn't my favourite. Wilkie Collins is one of those authors who I think I'm a bit up and down with, and some of his books I really enjoy and some of his books I like a bit less. And I think the more sensationalist novels that are more plot driven by him I like less, and the more character focused, character-driven, theme-driven novels by him I like more. And No Name is very much sensationalist. I thought, because I knew the premise, that it was going to be a bit more theme-driven than in fact it was. Basically, No Name follows a character called Magdalene and her sister Nora, although it's mostly focused on Magdalene. At the beginning of the book, Magdalene and Nora are very happy. They live with their parents, and then they learn immediately after their parents' death that their parents were not married when they had the children. Their father had originally been married to another woman, which meant their parents lived together out of wedlock for a very long time, until the father's wife died very recently, and then the parents got married. What the parents did not realise before their death is that if you get married, your previous will is invalidated in Victorian law, so all the money goes to his brother and the daughters are left absolutely destitute. And that's the kind of setup of the book, but the premise is really that Magdalene decides she wants her inheritance. She wants the inheritance that she feels is rightfully hers, and she will stop at nothing to get it, and various schemes occur. It's very sensationalist, very kind of plot-driven, crazy scheming going on, which I enjoyed in some ways. Like, it's quite gripping, but I didn't feel completely invested in the characters, which I think is partly because I liked Nora more than Magdalene, and the book was always focused on Magdalene, which from the beginning I thought we might get a bit more of a dual narrative between Nora and Magdalene, and actually I just kept on wanting to hear about Nora rather than Magdalene. And also because Magdalene is very unscrupulous and behaves in lots of immoral ways, so that your moral judgment is kind of skewed and you never know quite who to root for in the book, which I really enjoyed. I thought that was really clever, but I didn't feel that it was completely dealt with in the right way at the end. So there were some things I really enjoyed about No Name, but I definitely don't think it's my favourite Wilkie Collins so far. Definitely I think my favourite Wilkie Collins so far is probably Poor Miss Finch. I'm looking forward to reading more by him in the future because I have really enjoyed some of his work, but I think it just kind of varies from book to book. Another Victorian book I read in January was Phineas Finn by Anthony Trollope. This is the second book in the Palliser series and is the first book I read for my Trollope project, which is going throughout 2019, in which I'm aiming to read a book by Anthony Trollope every month. So off to a good start with that one. Not off to a good start with all the rest of my goals, as I didn't read my book for my TBR jar this month, but it's fine. I read my Trollope book and that's what matters. So Phineas Finn tells the story of a young man called Phineas Finn. He's Irish, but he comes to London to study law, and then he is encouraged to stand for Parliament. And so the book kind of follows his parliamentary career and his kind of relationship with various different women who he falls in and out of love with, and also the kind of various characters that surround them and the various plot lines that go on. I really, really enjoyed this. I think Phineas Finn, the main character in this, a bit like Alice, the main character in Can You Forgive Her, sometimes makes very bad decisions, but you also sympathise with Phineas and you also understand him. I really enjoyed the look at Parliament and kind of party politics in this. I thought that was really interesting, from a historical perspective as well as just from a narrative perspective, and I thought there were so many engaging characters in this. I loved Violet, I loved Lady Laura too. Lady Laura was fascinating, and her plotline I felt was one of the strongest in this book. Really, really compelling and interesting. I also liked Lord Chiltern, I thought he was really well done. There were just so many interesting characters in this, and like always Trollope's writing was just wonderful and so enjoyable. Another thing I quite liked in this, though a minor thing, is like it's quite common in Victorian literature to have a female character who is really, really good looking and therefore like everybody loves, and they kind of get on better in life. But I don't think it's often that I've read a Victorian book with a male character who is quite defined by their looks and whose people react to because of their looks. But in this book, Phineas Finn is like really good looking, and that means that's one of the reasons why he kind of gets on in Parliament and everybody seems to like him. And even like his landlady, who's like 20 years older than him, is a little bit in love with him, and which I just found quite funny and I thought was quite nicely done and was nice because it's a bit refreshing because you don't often find male characters in Victorian literature as defined by their looks as female characters. Anyway, a really good read. I love Anthony Trollope a lot. This was great fun. Then I also read Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith. This is a really fun little Victorian classic which Pan Macmillan collected Collectors Library very kindly sent me a review copy of. I think this new edition is coming out at the beginning of February. This is a really, really fun little Victorian read. Basically, it is the fictional diary of a lower middle class banking clerk in the late Victorian period, his relationship with his wife, his relationship with his son, his worries about trying to be respectable and trying to sort of get on in work, and it's so much about class and respectability. I spoke about this as well in another video I did recently called 5 Victorian Novels About Respectability, which I will link down below, because so much of this book is about respectability and Mr. Pooter, the main character, kind of trying to present a certain appearance to the world and trying to be a gentleman even though he doesn't always have enough money to be a gentleman. It's really interesting in terms of learning a bit more about Victorian everyday life, as well as being especially interesting in terms of class, and also just hilarious. Would highly recommend. On to two modern classics. This month I read The ABC Murders by Agatha Christie. I really love Agatha Christie a lot. She's just such a wonderful writer. This is one of her Poirot mysteries, and I picked it up because there was an adaptation of it at the very end of December, which I wanted to watch. I really enjoyed this one. I thought it was really clever and really well done, and I just really, really like Poirot. And I think this is the second book I've read narrated by Hastings, so it was quite nice to have Poirot and Hastings back together again. The premise of this is that the murderer in this is kind of going through the alphabet, so they kill someone whose surname begins with A in a town beginning with A, and then so on, kind of going through the ABC Railway Guide. They send kind of anonymous notes to Poirot so he can kind of like work out what's going on. Like every Agatha Christie I read, this was so fun and so clever, and I think this will probably be on the kind of upper end of my Agatha Christie love. This is one that I thought was really, really good. I then also read Temporary Kings by Anthony Powell, which is the 11th book in the Dance to the Music of Time series. I made a full video review of this for those who are going on in the read along, so I won't talk about it much here. Also, it's the 11th book in the series, but this is set in the 50s, and like the rest of the series, follows our narrator Nick and all the various people that he meets around him. I finished off reading one non-fiction book in the month of January, and that is Silk Roads by Peter Frankopan. This I've been listening to on audiobook for quite a while, I think since maybe November. I think I might have started it in non-fiction November, but it is quite long, as you can see. This was an interesting read. It is subtitled A New History of the World, and it's basically, I think its premise is that it is a history of the world with a focus on the Middle East rather than a focus on the West. However, I'm not sure it always achieves that goal. For me, it felt very much like the first third of the book was a history of the Middle East, the middle third of the book was a history of the world, and then the final third of the book was a history of like the West's involvement in the Middle East. I found this a really interesting and intriguing read. I'm not sure that I always think Peter Frankopan achieved his aims, and I'm not sure that the balance was always right in terms of where the history was focused. But I did find it really interesting, especially the second half. One thing I would say is that I listened to this on audiobook, and I kind of wish I had read it. I mean, I don't know, I think it would have taken me even longer to get through in book form, but I also, especially in the first half, I found it a little bit hard to focus on the audiobook, and I think I probably missed things. But regardless, I found it quite an interesting read, and definitely if you're interested in the kind of history of the Middle East through a long period of time, this is one I would recommend. Unusually, I only read 2 contemporary novels this month, although I suppose the 6 unpublished things I read for work were also contemporary fiction, so there we go. Anyway, one book I read was Miss Ice Sandwich by Meiko Kawakami. This was fantastic. This was one of my favourite reads of the month, and just really, really delightful and warm and moving, and it's so short as well. I would really, really highly recommend this. It reminded me how much I love Japanese fiction. It tells the story of a young boy, I think he's about 12, and basically he becomes infatuated with this woman who works at the local supermarket, who he names Miss Ice Sandwich because she serves sandwiches and she has like really unusual eye makeup, and he just thinks she's really, really cool, but everyone at his school kind of thinks she's weird. And it's partly about his kind of fascination and interest in this woman who stands out from society and other people judge because of it, but he just thinks is amazing. And it's partly about that, and it's partly about his relationship with a girl at school called Tuti, who he becomes kind of friends with. And then the other sort of strand in the book is that his grandmother, who he lives with along with his mother, his grandmother is very, very ill, has been very ill for a long time, but is kind of dying throughout the course of this book. It's just, for a tiny book, it really packs a punch. I found it really emotional, really enjoyable, really like sweet and lovely and uplifting, but also dealing with like serious things. Just, yeah, I would highly, highly recommend this. Might end up in my favourites of the year in, you know, 11 months. I just thought it was really, really wonderful. Yeah, would highly recommend. And the other contemporary fiction book I read this month is Mr. Peacock's Possessions by Lydia Sison. So this is published by Zaffa, which is where I work, so I'm not going to review this exactly. Part of the reason why I read this in January is because the paperback edition is coming out in March and I was working on the paperback edition. So this is a trade paperback, by the way, which are like export editions which come out at the same time as hardback, but I actually love a trade paperback myself because they are as big as hardbacks but without being as heavy, which is the ideal. But anyway, that's a tangent for another day. Mr. Peacock's Possessions is a really, really fascinating novel, one that I really enjoyed. It is set in the late 19th century in a Pacific island somewhere around the region of New Zealand, and it follows a family who live on this island called the Peacocks, who have been on this remote island trying to make it their home and trying to settle there and grow things there for a few years. And after a few years, several native islanders from other islands in the area come to work on the island for them, and it's about the relationships between the islanders and the settlers and about the relationships between this very complicated family of the Peacocks. We kind of follow two main perspectives: Lizzie Peacock, who is the daughter of Mr. Peacock in the title, and Kalala, who is one of the islanders who comes to work on this place. The setting is really rich and atmospheric, and the characterization is very good. And the way this book looks at gender and kind of late 19th century ideas about masculinity, I found really interesting as well. This is a book I would highly recommend for those of you who enjoyed something like The Luminaries. This is a book that I haven't seen spoken about that much on BookTube, but I think it's one that a lot of people on BookTube would really enjoy. So that is all. Those are all the books that I can talk about that I read in the month of January. Please do let me know if you've read any of the books I spoke about and what you thought of them. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back hopefully quite soon with another bookish video.